Welcome. Today we are going to address Antinomianism as well as wrap up our Section 3 discussions. So like always, we're going to begin our discussion today by asking you, what the heck is an antinomian? What are your thoughts when you hear this term? There's really not something that you probably are all that familiar with. It's not a term that you encounter every day. It's not as common as even some of the other things that we've addressed that some of you are like, yeah, I'm not quite sure about that one. It also doesn't have a meaning that is plain in English as opposed to Greek or Hebrew or Pali or any other language. It's not just a language barrier with antinomianism. You may think, first of all, it starts with that notion of anti, so it's against something. And if that's your thought, then you're half right. You're getting close. The definition of an antinomian is that you're breaking the law. It's against the law. Others might have perceptions of it being, libertines who exist from all ages who believe that the law simply does not apply to them. This is not a general disregard for the law, but maintaining, quite aptly, that the laws simply don't apply. There's no reason for the law to apply to me. It might apply to you, but not to me. So what laws are we addressing? After all, there's certain laws that I know you likely break on a fairly regular basis. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, sometimes you think that they don't have any other greater value. There's things like texting laws and speeding laws that are broken all the time by many people. Anything that you view as pointless or unnecessary. Specifically, though, for antinomians, the idea is the law of Moses is what you're breaking, what doesn't apply. Now, this is a much different sort of notion of law, and it's not because you're not religious and therefore I can do what I want. In fact, its history goes the other direction. Early antinomians were actually a group of Gnostic heretics. Now, to be fair, antinomian is actually a fairly new term and is generally only an issue that exists within Protestantism, which we'll address momentarily. And the term actually originated during the Protestant Reformation, but you see some of the ideas of antinomianism early on, not within the church, but alongside of it. That's why the notion of it being a heresy is important. The most famous of these Gnostic sects that were advocated for breaking of the law came from Simon Magus in the 2nd century. The group were known as Simonians. It was a dualistic sect which had an elaborate cosmology which included a separate sphere for heaven and earth, male and female forms of the divine powers. That thought became manifest in female forms as a way of punishment by the lesser emanations of the god, who was neither male nor female. As the thought moved from one woman to another, it eventually rested upon a lady by the name of Helena, and Simon Magus became the prophet of this group and said that he was the greatest power of God, and he released the female thoughts from Helena. This is the real deliverance of humanity from the laws of God in the Old Testament, is the union of these two together. Obviously, other odd ideas existed within this group, as what we've seen here is already rather odd, including notions of idolatry being fine and fornication, what they called perfect love. Basically, they regarded that nothing in itself was good or bad by nature, an idea that we see within other sort of philosophical systems, such as Stoicism. But unlike Stoicism, what deemed an action good or bad wasn't the nature of the thing, but your relation to Simon Magus. As long as you acknowledge Simon as the power of God, and therefore received Simon's grace, you were fine. Eusebius, in the 3rd and 4th century, his work Church History, calls the Simonians the most immoral and depraved of all mankind. This idea of eliminating the law was generally viewed as only cause to commit grave acts. So, do we have other forms of antinomianism that are within the church that we could talk about for Catholics or Orthodox or Judaism for that matter? Obviously, it's very contrary to the notions of halakha, and so we wouldn't have an expression of this within Judaism, which tells you to uphold the law. Similarly, in our discussion of Catholic and Orthodox, we don't really have antinomianism that exists. And there's a simple reason why it wouldn't exist for Catholic and Orthodox strains. The idea was that of authority. The authority is not found in the individual for Catholics and Orthodox, but the church. If the church has the authority, the laws and the rules and the norms established by the church are therefore binding. God's grace is found in the church, and the practices, including the laws of the church, are there as an example of God's grace for you. The same idea as what's being advocated in halakha within Judaism. In other words, things like penance are not punishments because God hates you, but it's loving discipline. Through notions of this are not always easy to see. You go to confession because it's good for you, not because God doesn't like you or is being mean. It's a loving act of discipline. There's a major difference between Protestants on the one side and Catholics and Orthodox on the other. When, for instance, the Catholic Church and St. Augustine says that salvation is found only within the church, this is not an arrogant stance, but is one that's called to make all people equal, communing with one another, and that this is indeed where salvation is found. In our discussion of hesychism, we brought up the phrase that exists within Orthodox circles that you're saved together and damned alone. The emphasis is that your salvation is not something that you do individually. While you take individual accountability, for both Orthodox and Catholics, your salvation is something that is a corporatized act. For Protestantism, and different forms of Protestants will emphasize this differently, the idea is it's about you and your salvation. Strictest notions we're going to see within Calvinism, it's the are you the elect question and your individual responsibility and relation to God. And therefore, the idea of what laws apply to you are not something that's dictated by the church, but by your individual relation to the divine. The individual is therefore what the modern world promotes and is against the traditional views of Christianity. This will cause issues for Protestants who remove the authority of the church, but also want to keep some of those norms in place. How do you remove one part and yet keep the whole together? Static analysis is a dangerous thing. By the way, though, this is why reformers like Luther and Zwingli both affirmed the sacrament of confession at the Marburg Colloquy. This was eliminated within both of the churches within a few generations, but these founders, these reformers, liked the idea. They thought there was value still in it. Before addressing the specific Protestant forms of antinomianism that exists, there is a sort of general vibe of antinomianism that exists within modern society as well as societies of every age. The appeal to all sorts of people who don't really want to think that the laws of society or God apply to them. You have numerous examples of people of all stripes who maintain this. In fact, we even see political expressions rising up and new corporate bodies who hold this idea of antinomianism. Strict forms of this we would see as notions of anarchists. Right? Anarchists believe that there should be no rules and that we would all order our own lives and that society itself is something unnatural, very close to notions of what the actual cynics believed. You have a slightly more restrained version in libertarianism. Libertarianism is the American political party which wants as little regulation on any person or business as possible. They want a very thin veneer of government that holds people together that anarchy doesn't want. Many people view libertarianism and or anarchy as everyone holding everyone else hostage, where there is no government and everyone just operates out of fear of neighbor. Or it's some sort of immoral, selfish people who want to get all theirs while they can. Oftentimes, a criticism of libertarianism is that they're falling into a new religion, the religion of the free market, which, seeing as many members of libertarianism are opposed to organized religion in general, kind of fits, at least to a certain extent. By the way, it's not always the case, and it shouldn't be simply stated that all libertarians are immoral, selfish people who want to just get theirs while they can. In fact, many libertarians give to charities and care for the less fortunate, but argue that this should be done by private charities and not the government. That there is a greater percentage of the actual dollars donated that gets to the people through private charity as opposed to public programs. That it's an issue of efficiency and actually falling into what we're hoping when we're going to give some of our money. In fact, they would point out that private charities usually have less overhead than your massive public programs, and they're slower to fall into what's known as the iron law of bureaucracy. The iron law of bureaucracy states that in any bureaucracy, the people devoted to the benefit of the bureaucracy itself will always get in control, and those dedicated to the goals of the bureaucracy, the reason why the bureaucracy was set up in the first place, will have less and less influence over the future. And sometimes that second group is eliminated entirely. You can all probably think of a handful of organizations that were created for a very good purpose. But as time went by, they don't care about that purpose that much anymore. They care far more about protecting the interests of that organization, even if the mission of the organization goes away entirely. There are, of course, those who kind of model notions of antinomianism in their disregard of the law because they're sociopaths or sociopath lights or those who have sociopathic tendencies. Their individual sociopathy often leads them to the belief that the laws and the rules that the rest of society operate with simply don't apply to them. You probably know a few sociopaths. You can probably think of a few right now. What are they like? Many of them are actually really friendly and fun to be around. Oftentimes, they're the life of the party, and some of which are born salesmen and saleswomen. They can kind of move other people and kind of bring you along, and it's really engaging to be around them. There are people who you're kind of excited to be in their orbit of. There are people like former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who oftentimes is pointed out through biographies and interviews and stories of those who know him, say that he just doesn't care about the rules that the rest of society has to follow. They don't really apply to him at all. And that a lot of people will say that part of the reason for his success in bodybuilding and acting and governance all comes from the fact that he doesn't care about the rules of everybody else. That he's just going to do what he wants, and let the consequences be what they may. This, by the way, also includes some of his own personal relationships, which is why he impregnated a maid and has a son who looks a whole lot like him. Right? This idea that the laws and rules of everybody else don't apply to me, even marriage vows, because the rest of society is going to hold on to this. I can do what I want. There are other groups of people, oftentimes referred to as the Trustafarian, right? Those rich kids, those middle and upper middle class and upper class children who live like they're homeless, but are really rather wealthy. They live off of begging and their parents' money, knowing that they can return to a respectable life whenever they want. But they kind of have their own little lifestyle, and it's funded by their parents, and they can kind of do whatever they want because they know that the real consequences that apply to everybody else, the laws that everyone else has, doesn't really apply to them. They've got a really nice safety net when they want to go back, but now they get to kind of live this other life and return when they want to, if indeed they ever do want to. There are also other groups of people who, just say, hey, maybe I don't have that safety net, but I'm wanting to take everything that you're going to offer me. And because I don't have anything, maybe we see this, in other examples, that they're immune to consequences. You can't take anything from me. I don't have anything else. You're going to arrest me? You're going to throw me in jail? Fantastic. I got a place to stay tonight. No problem. No consequences. The laws don't apply. I'm immune. Again, we saw this also in earlier forms with Greek cynicism in a higher, more philosophical example, although maybe not that much different. And so sometimes sociopaths are those salesmen, sometimes they're political elites or leaders of industry. Sometimes they're just adolescents living out their angst, or those who don't have anything and say, forget it. What are you going to do? You can't touch me. I'm bulletproof. Or it could have philosophical strains with it. All of this has a certain sort of tendency or lean within notions of antinomianism, right? This idea that the laws simply don't apply. Now, they've got different roots and causes, but this idea is still there. And while there are different political forms and different relational examples of sociopathy, there are philosophical ideas that advocate this as well, and has a freeing aspect of the passions. If the laws don't apply to you, the passions that dictate you, you're either free to indulge or not. And you can kind of see the consequences as they lay on your shoulders and your relations. And sociopathy is not necessarily just a cognitive disorder or the byproduct of being an entitled jerk, although it can be. But it could be a philosophy that governs one's life. It's a worldview that has some reasons behind it. For instance, we can ask ourselves the question, why should I help somebody on the side of the road? Why is it that you could think of that we should help somebody? There's a social compact. Great. I don't care. It's nice. I don't care. It won't take long and you could really make their life better. I still don't care. It doesn't matter. It's only a minor inconvenience. Yeah, it's okay. Guess what? I don't care. Somebody will think that you're a bad person. Wouldn't you like somebody else to help you out? I don't care. That's really it. It all goes back to this idea of not caring, not engaging, not making the laws and rules of the rest of society dictate how I respond. While this person might sound petty and small, unless you actually have some sort of real punishment that makes them think that they ought to do something, It's just a suggestion. And why should I have to live up to your suggestions? If there's no punishment, why should you do anything at all? The idea that you're immune to the law really serves as the basis for historic antinomianism as we see it within Protestantism in general. The purpose of this class, we're going to look at two variants of this and the reasons why you are immune from the law. We have our Lutheran-based antinomians and we have our Calvinist-based antinomians. Now, you should notice here that I'm using the term based. Lutheranism, properly speaking, and Calvinism, properly speaking, doesn't hold the antinomianist position. In fact, they would push back and reject this. But there are justifications out of Luther and out of Calvin's ideas that fuel the antinomian, and therefore it's out of their teaching that we have the basis for these new trends within Protestantism. For the Lutheran-based antinomian, we have the very central idea within Lutheranism that you are saved by faith alone. If you're saved by faith alone, that means nothing else saves you. That also means nothing else condemns you. What are the real ramifications of the idea that you are saved simply by faith? One of which is that if you start to look at your acts as justification, then that shows in fact that you're not having enough faith. And maybe that you're not actually saved. Luther would reject this idea, but a lot of people kind of picked up with it. No works necessary for salvation, no works to condemn. It means it doesn't really matter what I do, therefore I can do anything I want. Woohoo! The law doesn't apply. Now, Calvinists have a different sort of basis for their idea of antinomianism, and that's the idea of the unconditional election. If you are elected by God unconditionally, that means there are no conditions. That means whatever actions you have done or will do don't impact your election. If you love somebody unconditionally, that means you love them regardless of what they do. Well, isn't the law, in this case, a condition? Doesn't apply. Conversely, within Calvinism, we even get the idea that if God doesn't elect you, then why does it matter that you follow God's laws? There's not going to be any benefit or cost to you one way or the other, and therefore it's really just the whims of God and not any sort of following of the laws of God that we have to find ourselves on the good graces of. So, true believers can do no wrong, while the reprobate can do no right. And the law doesn't serve as any real purpose, according to those who take this version of Calvinism. So does this mean I can be evil according to Luther and Calvin? I can do whatever I want? Unfortunately, no. Unlike the Simonians, who really kind of say reject the law and set up their own communities to do so, within Lutheranism and Calvinism, the role of the law is far more theoretical. And what you actually found historically by looking at Protestant antinomians is that they were usually more moral than the rest of society. They followed the law, but not because of the law. Odd sort of weird twist. The short answer for Calvin and Luther is that God saves you regardless of the works of the law, but the only way to know that you're the elect or that you have a living faith is your desire to love God, and one way you show that is by following those laws. So it doesn't quite fit as easily as saying I can do whatever I want, because what you want then is to try to follow God. The laws can exist only as a guidepost, and the same reason why you don't, hurt your friends or your loved ones is not because the law says not to do it, but because you care about them. Still, antinomianism in its broader conception is a trap for Protestantism in general, and experiential Protestants, like the Pietists we've talked about a little bit more specifically. When it's all about the idea that you're the elect, then the idea that you're special and the laws that everyone else have to follow changes how you're going to see everything. I mean, you don't need laws in your friendship. You don't need laws in your marriage, not just because it's a legal contract and binding. Children don't obey the laws of their parents because it's commanded to them, but out of notions of obedience and love. So if you're chosen by God and are the elect and adopted children, then why do you need the laws? This is a real serious question, and while Luther and Calvin have their different reasons and justifications for the law, this is a very real and living option to fall into this trap of antinomianism. In fact, there are even thoughts that we might even be more moral with less laws. There are some good sides to the idea of antinomianism. It's a trap for everybody and societies as well. We can follow what's known as Goodhart's law and understand this maybe a little more clear. Goodhart's law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. If your focus is on following the rule, then you're going to forget the reasons why those rules exist. And oftentimes you're going to get maybe the opposite of what the rules are set up to accomplish. We have all sorts of fun historical examples of this, one of which came out of the Soviet Union. There was a problem that the nail factories didn't make enough nails and there was too much waste. So what did they do? They simply had a target. Right? Here's the target. We want nails, and the measure that we're going to say this is we're going to say that we need to have X amount of nails before you're done working for the day, etc., etc. So what did people do? They started making thousands of tiny nails. The law didn't really work. The measure of success became the target, became the goal, and it failed to accomplish what they really wanted. So, of course, what did they do? They shifted their incentives. They shifted their ideas and said, no, it's not going to be about the number of nails anymore. It's going to be about the weight of the nails. So what did people do? They also shifted. And instead they made less but heavier nails. And also didn't accomplish the real goal of, having nails that worked for people. Right? We have this problem when a measure becomes a target. It's no longer that good measure. That we're wanting people to follow the spirit of the law and not the letter of the law. People too oftentimes find ways of achieving the target, but forgetting the reasons why they're doing that, what you're trying to actually measure. Same thing, by the way, happens all over the place. We have another example of the Brits running into a problem of cobras existing in India. Too many cobras causing problems. So they put a bounty on cobras to incentivize people to hunt them down. What did people do? They started breeding cobras so they could bring them in and get the bounty. What happens as a result of that? Well, you actually have more cobras in India afterwards than before. Same thing also, by the way, happens to education in America. We want to demonstrate that students are learning by increasing graduation rates. Graduation rates become the key, and important way of understanding that people are learning. So we start to change what's required to graduate. Oregon, for instance, eliminated reading and math proficiency requirements. Massachusetts is currently reworking their comprehensive assessment system to do the same thing. This is not limited to these two states either, but different states and regions are working on this all the time. How do we increase this number? Forgetting that the real goal is, how do we educate people? No, education is found by graduation rates, therefore we just need to graduate more people. No, the stress, the emphasis should be on making sure the populace is educated. So there is a good side to saying, let's not be so legalistic and follow the laws. Maybe the laws shouldn't be what we're trying to apply, but the principles behind these laws, and sometimes the laws aren't the best way of getting to those principles. So now we need to adjust and take what we've learned from the values of laws or rules or relations and how this applies to the passions. You should look back at your pro and con sheets that hopefully you've been filling out through the course of these discussions and think about what are the pros and cons to halacha and hesychism and medieval Catholic asceticism in addition to pietism and antinomianism. What are the advantages that each of these have? What are the disadvantages? Obviously, we can't hold all of them in concert. Antinomianism and halakha aren't going to walk hand in hand, skipping down the road. But yet, we might get some ideas out of pietism and halakha that overlap, or asceticism within Catholicism, or hesychism, and different ways of ground where they can work together. What are the things that you think work with these systems, and what are the things that you think doesn't? Then I think it's best that you actually stop and rank them. What order do you put these in? Which ones work best for you? Which ones work best for other people? You might be perfectly fine that, hey, this one works for me, but do I really want my neighbor to follow this? How do they work in identifying the passions and helping you to overcome them? Is this easy to do with all of them? Which one of these systems you say, that's just not going to help me at all? I personally need this, and this system says I shouldn't bother with that. Find the right twist and discussion, and which one's your favorite and which one's your least favorite. Take the time to actually lay it down and identify it. Then you should ask yourselves, of these systems that we talked about, are they ethical systems or religious systems? They all kind of grow historically one way or the other out of a religious system, but are they really just ethical applications? What's the difference between halakha, hesychism, medieval Catholic asceticism, and Stoicism and Epicureanism and cynicism? Is there a difference between this and Buddhist notions of nirodha? Or are you going to put any of those in the religious system instead? But what's the key difference between them, and how should you proceed? So after you've weighed each of these systems, you have the pros and cons, and you know which ones you like and you know which ones you don't like. You know what works for you and which ones might work better for your neighbor. You should make sure you have everything available and go find the paper prompt in Canvas. Remember that this is not a timed assignment, although it does have a set due date. I want you to spend some time actually writing this down, and it's not a test, it's a paper. I want you to write it and stop and reread it. I'm trying to apply notions of Goodhart's law within ourselves, right? We don't want the measure to be a timed throwing everything back, but we want a good paper that has got your ideas clearly expressed, and so hopefully having a little more time to do that will accomplish that task. So make sure you go in there and check it out. It should be unlocked by now.